A very good morning. My name is Prashant Singh. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Human Rights Studies. I would like to welcome you all for the inaugural session of Jindal Harvard Conference on Poverty, Human Rights and Development, Public Policy for the Common Good. The conference is being organized by the Center for Human Rights Studies and the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy in association with the Program on Human Rights and Development, Harvard University. Now I'd like to take this opportunity to invite Professor C. Rajkumar to give the welcome address.
Very good morning to all of you. It's indeed a pleasure for all of us here at OP Jindal Global University to invite you to the conference, which is jointly organized by the Program on Human Rights and Development at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, as well as Jindal School of Government and Public Policy and the Jindal Global Law School and the Center for Human Rights Studies. The theme of the conference is intrinsically interdisciplinary. It has the word poverty in it. It has the word human rights in it. It has the word development in it. As if that was not already enough, it also has the word public policy in it. And to make things even more difficult, it has the word common good in it. Now, of course, only an academic institution can work towards having so many words in a conference and attempt to have a meaningful conversation over 2 days. But that's the challenge that we have undertaken. I sincerely hope that the next 2 days of conversation surrounding various thematic sessions will dwell upon the most nuanced engagement in relation to the relationship between these issues. As much as these issues sound at times for people who may not be familiar with some of these issues as significantly different from each other, they obviously have a very direct and even inextricable relationship with each other. The framework of issues surrounding poverty has been addressed by many individuals. Although economists have taken the lead in addressing issues surrounding poverty, there are a number of sociologists, anthropologists, and lawyers who have attempted to address this issue. In fact, way back in the year 2000, the UNDP's Human Development Report had the theme, this was almost 17 years ago, which actually had the theme on human rights and development. And Professor Amartya Sen, who wrote a very inspiring introduction to that UNDP report, talked about the relationship between human rights and development, and indeed looked at how it will be useful to see this discourse and what we gain from looking issues surrounding development from the rights standpoint, and how rights people or human rights people should be focusing on the development dimensions or economic dimensions of it. I think it's also fair to say that the larger framework of addressing the challenge of poverty has been assumed by the government in particular, and that's where the question of public policy and our attempts to speak truth to power has been dealt upon. I really hope that with the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy leading this effort, there will be many dimensions of public policy, and its impact in addressing the problem of poverty will be discussed in the course of the next couple of days. I think it is also fair to mention that we are organizing this conference building upon a number of experiences that many of us have had. The Dean of our Public Policy School, Professor Sudarshan, spent the last several decades working for the UNDP and the Ford Foundation. And we have the key architect of the conference, Professor Stephen Marx, our partner and friend, who is a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health, but heads the program on human rights and development, has served for many years in the UN system, including being participant in the decisions and discussions surrounding the right to development. We can't help but also recognize and remember the contribution of Professor Arjun Singh Gupta, who has been a very close friend of the university for many, many years. His own contributions as the UN Special Rapporteur on both extreme poverty and human rights and the right to development, and also his work under the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector. We are also conscious of the fact that we have a vibrant law school which is looking at issues surrounding development and poverty from the standpoint of what laws and legal systems can do. I was a student in Delhi University in the year 94, 97, and in the year 1995, again, which is literally 20 years ago, I took a course called entitled Law and Poverty. There was a book edited by Professor Upendra Bakshi on law and poverty, and there were only 2 students who took that course. Delhi University had the luxury of still offering the course, and so 2 of us used to be part of that seminar called Law and Poverty. I bring this to the attention of all of you because it's important to recognize the context of why poverty, and Bakshi would call it impoverishment. The idea of impoverishment is deeply embedded in our effort to address issues surrounding social exclusion. And that's why the concept of human rights, and in all its forms and manifestations, need to be connected with our efforts to address poverty and our attempts to seek development. I would like to take a moment to welcome our distinguished guest for the inaugural session. Dr. Ratan Rai does not need any introduction to this audience. He is the director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Public Policy, which is not a think tank, but a research institution of eminence. He also serves as a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and I am very delighted that he has accepted our invitation and is present on this occasion. I also want to take a moment to thank and appreciate the presence of very distinguished individuals who will be speaking at the various thematic sessions and panels. Lastly, I will say that it has been our endeavor to ensure that all our panels and conferences and initiatives that we promote ensure fair and balanced gender representation. I apologize that this particular panel, but also some parts of the conference, do not have sufficient representation of women, and we will make sure that in the future this doesn't occur. With those words, I would like to welcome all of you to the conference, and thank you very much.
I join Professor Raj in welcoming all the participants and all the distinguished guests. Now I would like to invite Professor Stephen Marx to outline the objectives of the conference.
Good morning, everybody. Let me begin by telling you how pleased I am to partner with Jindal Global University in hosting this conference. I would also like to start by echoing the final observation that Raj made. We're quite proud, those of us who've been involved with JGU from the beginning, in some of the statistics of a relatively well-balanced student body of 42% female and 58% male, and a even better balanced faculty, 45% female and 55% male. That's close to gender equality, not quite. This conference, unfortunately, in the panel is not representative of the commitment that this university has to gender equality. And of course, I agree with Raj that future activities will make an endeavor to be much more balanced in terms of gender. But that's not the purpose of my comments. It's one of the purposes of my comments today is to set the stage for this collaboration. Siraj Kumar and I met many years ago in Hong Kong, where we co-taught a course on human rights and development. Raj himself is a distinguished world-class scholar on this topic, editing many books and many articles dealing with the overlapping of the themes of development, human rights, and poverty. It has been an ongoing topic of interest in the collaboration between him and me at the personal level and our institutions at a broader level. More recently, and as will be the subject of a special session tomorrow afternoon, we have been collaborating for the last 2 years, and now the 3rd year, on a summer school for JGU students on the theme of human rights and development. Now, Raj, in his wisdom, added, as he was saying, to the array of terms in the title of this conference, the concept of the common good. I was a little surprised at that, because in the past, we have dealt with this issue, interjecting the theme of government's part sometimes, and interjecting the theme of public policy there, poverty, human rights, development, sustainable development, all those issues. Why did he toss in the common good. And I said, okay, what are we going to do with this idea of the common good? And I realized that there are two ways in which the common good in the title of this program is going to be relevant to our deliberations for the next 2 days. First of all, it's an ancient concept. It goes back to antiquity, in which the concept of the common good was the deepest understanding of the purpose of government, so that all those engaged in, or all those members of society, benefit equally from the actions of the state. And I realized that this deep philosophical concept is actually key to the intersection of poverty, human rights, and development in the current framework in which India and other countries around the world are addressing the issue, namely the 2030 Development Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda for Sustainable Development, begins with the first Sustainable Development Goal, which is elimination of poverty. And all of the development goals have as their underlying theme to leave no one behind. Now that's a slogan. You can toss that into a resolution and governments will vote for it in the General Assembly of the United Nations. You can get away with it. But the deeper sense, and that's why I attribute the intentionality to Raj Kumar in injecting the concept of the common good here, is that if the common good is the ultimate objective, it is based on the idea that you do not leave somebody behind. That the development process is one that benefits all. Now, what we're going to deal with in the next 2 days is the reality that development processes function in a way that benefits some more than others. And economists don't hesitate to measure and articulate and acknowledge the fact that there are winners and losers when there's transformation of economic processes. And so the economists say to the philosophers and the human rights specialists, live with it. That's the way the economy functions. There are winners and losers. But the concept of the common good and the concept of leave no one behind in the Sustainable Development Objectives suggests that we can do better than that. We can bridge the gap better. We can acknowledge that the process of economic development is an extremely complex one and that there are tensions. But if we set as our goal and objective and are constantly challenging ourselves to leave no one behind, then the common good might actually be an accomplishment of government. And that's where the final concept comes in, is the concept of public policy. We are collaborating with Dean Sudarshan in the School of Public Policy and Government as one of the partners, along with YSR Murthy's Center for Human Rights Studies. Now, I couldn't hope for a better range of collaborators and knowledgeable people on how to integrate in a meaningful way, not just in juxtaposing slogans, but in a meaningful way, public policy issues that do aim at the concept of the common good. Can this be done? What are the public policies to do it? What needs to be done in India and elsewhere to accomplish that? Is it true that human rights can be integrated into the development process when we have an observable dialogue of the deaf between human rights specialists who are perceived by economists as being absolutists? They want all good things for everybody at the same time. Of course, we economists know better. You can't do that because obviously we are dealing with the real world where there are finite goods, and you can't do it. So this tension between the expectations of a human rights framework, represented by YSR Murthy and his center here, the realities that government, that public policy has to deal with, represented by Sudarshan and his school here, and the distinguished panelists that we have coming here who deal with these issues at the professional level, at the academic and the professional level, are going to help answer the question, in this era of the launching of the Sustainable Development Goals the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, is it possible to reconcile the measurement of poverty as economists see it, because goal 1 is poverty, that's our first theme. How do we understand poverty in a way that is meaningful to the other thematic goals of this conference? Secondly, how do we concretely integrate a human rights framework into that? And this raises a very tough question when the decision makers have more important things to do than to listen to these nice human rights people and let them stay in their place. What happens if they take them seriously? How do we do it? And thirdly, economic perspectives on human development. How far have we come to move from the growth model of development, which after all is what the governors of the central banks of the world and the ministers of finance think development is, toward Amartya Sen's project represented by the work of the United Nations Development Program on the human development agenda. Human development is different from growth-based development. Is it possible to formulate a program? On the third session, we will be addressing that, of introducing the economic perspectives into human development. And the fourth section, of course, brings us back to public policy. If we are going to take these issues seriously of integrating the various goals that the international community has identified, what does it mean for public policy where people have an official responsibility for addressing the issue of poverty reduction and promotion of the development agenda? And that will bring us then to a session in which we will look critically at what is going on in implementing in year 1 now of the, or year 2 of the development agenda. Who is doing it? Who is doing what? India has submitted at the end of last year its support to the high-level political forum. What has been the response of civil society to that? And then we will look at the way ahead. So this is the overview of the themes. It is a great pleasure for me on behalf of my program on human rights and development at Harvard University to engage in this collaboration. I look forward to especially the keynote speaker that we have for this morning. So I apologize for being so long, but these are themes that engage us all passionately, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Marx. Now, over to Dr. Ratan Roy for the keynote address.
Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you, Vice Chancellor, and thank you, colleagues, Sudarshan, Vinod, others, for inviting me to Jindal. It's always a pleasure to be back. I actually gave the commencement address when the School of Public Policy was founded, and I have fond and sometimes envious memories of spending an evening on this campus at that point. Unfortunately, I will not be able to stay with you for the last 2 days because, as you all know, there are banking scams happening, and that requires all hands to deck. I would like to congratulate Jindal. One final gender comment. I've signed a pledge, and the pledge is never to be part of a manual, and if I absolutely have to be, to say so. I didn't need to say so because your Vice Chancellor very generously acknowledged the issue, but I have to really congratulate him for being the first university, he tells me, in the world, but certainly in India, to achieve faculty parity. That is quite remarkable because there's a whole committee I was part of in England. It's a long story. It's one of the most difficult things to achieve, consistent with equity. So congratulations, this is wonderful. And I think all the men and women here are very lucky to be in an institution which takes gender seriously. And this is not March 10, so this is not a gestural statement I'm making. Okay, I deliberately didn't write anything down because I knew that there would be an interesting address preceding me, and I thought it would be helpful for everyone if I took that as my baseline and proceeded. With your permission, sir, I'll finish in about 20 minutes, and then I'd like to take up to 3 questions from the students. Is that all right? So please, if you have questions, I'll take the first 3. Let me start with a story. When I was in UNDP, I was hired as an economist. I worked there for 15 years, and I got bumped upstairs. So in the process of getting bumped upstairs, I became head of something or the other, I can't remember now, in New York. And I had suddenly under me something called human rights-based budgeting. And I had $2 million from the Germans, and I had one very interesting German sort of junior young professional. She was excellent. We're still friends. So I said, Julia, that was her name. You know, this human rights business, I come from a third world country. We're terrible at it. We lock people up and torture them and beat them up. So why don't you go to your nice countries and tell me how they have incorporated human rights into budgeting? So she went to the Nordics, and you know what? And the Nordics, well, they all had one answer except Germany. And then the Nordics came to see me, Norway. I'll name them. This is about 10 years ago. And they said, what kind of an absurd question are you asking? We don't need human rights budgeting. We have human rights. It's everywhere. I said, but you also had Quisling. Those who don't know who Quisling is, please look it up. And if you had Quisling, surely you recovered from Quisling. And your friends, the Danes, were doing genetic experiments in 1945. Your entire continent gave birth to fascism. Europe collectively has killed more people in world wars than anybody in human history. So all I'm asking is how you transited to the state of sublime Zen that you're in now. But they found the question offensive. And this is, I think, an important reason for why there is dissonance between, if you like, people who view development in a certain way, including economists, and the human rights community, is different what we call ontologies. Ontologies essentially are where we see the essence of what we are speaking of. Let me give you 4 examples. I'll give you one from economics. Any economics students here? Yes? Okay, I'm sure you don't know this. Piketty won't tell you. Actually, Piketty does if you read him carefully. What is the biggest driver of inequality in any society in the world? Developing, everything. What is the biggest driver ever? It is, you don't know, do you? If you did, wow. I'll offer you a job without a PhD. It is inheritance. The fact that you have the right to create assets and accumulate them and give them, doesn't have to be a progeny, but to whoever you like, means that essentially stocks of wealth are passed down without exchange, and the flows of wealth that are created by those who don't possess those stocks to counteract this stock effect have to constantly correct for this stock inequality. That is the biggest driver of inequality in the world. Now, if you want to deal with equity as a right, I ask you, will you give me the end of inheritance as a right? I ask you. I should have been a lawyer. If you give it to me, I will walk your journey on inequity. But I don't notice, in fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, correct me if I'm wrong, it's been years since I read it, does refer to the family as some sort of principal organizing unit of society. Now, that is fine as a social construct, but why should that be taken for granted by me as an economist, as an economic construct? I take it for granted, paradoxically, because the sociologists have told me, much like the economists tell you, live with it. You're never going to get rid of the family. Look at the Soviet Union. You know, you need to own your own toothbrush, but you also need to be able to give your bank accounts down. And therefore, when people like Bill Gates do what they have done, I'm very encouraged, because it actually means an interrogation of this. So that is one example of ontology. The second is the notion of the common good. The notion of the common good never for a moment intended to talk until, I would say, at least, Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of mainstream philosophy, until the French Revolution or just thereabouts, about equality of humans. Certainly not men and women, until very recently. And the common good was perceived in the context of a society whose structure was given to you in terms of defined and mutually accepted inequalities between groups of people. So whether you look at Chinese society, or you look at the Arthashastra, or you look at what Shivaji wrote, or you look at the writings of 14th century philosophers in Europe or Japan, the notion of the common good already involved a socio-economic hierarchy which was taken as given, and of which, of course, inheritance in the family, which is a common line, formed an important part. So when we interrogate the common good, we are undertaking 2 experiments at once in contemporary times. We are doing away with the state as the repository of common good that is stratified, common good, towards a sort of Rousseauian universalistic state that deals with the common good of all. Yeah? In fact, I would argue provocatively that one state that I know of, I know it's your favorite state now as Indians. I'm an Indian too, it's not my favorite state. The state of Israel distinguishes between its citizens, and it's remarkably effective at delivering equity within those distinctions. There is equity amongst Palestinians or non-Jewish, citizens of the State of Israel, and there is equity amongst Jewish citizens of the State of Israel. There's no equity between them. Not something you'll normally hear, but it's like it is. But it's, overall, if you look at it, it's a great state, very egalitarian. So that's the second kind of tension I'm trying to point out in ontologies. The third, so those are two examples of ontology. I want to now move to talking about rights as an economist like me, who is not Amartya Sen, understands it. Actually, my PhD thesis, which was on the politics of fiscal policy 33 years ago, had an entire chapter on rights. So I think an interesting definition for an economist, well, for a social scientist, let's start there, of a right is a politically, and this brings in governance and public policy, is a politically defendable claim. And as an economist, I go further and narrow it, so I speak of economic rights, as a politically defendable claim over assets and resource flows. Both are important. Now, the interesting thing is not whether the claim exists or not. The claim becomes a right insofar as it is well or weakly defined. So in a society where, let's say the right to free speech is a claim I make to free speech, and society and public policy enforces that claim in coherent ways that people understand, the claim is well defended and therefore becomes a right. And when it is weakly defended, then that doesn't stop being a right, it becomes a contested right. And when it is not defensible at all, it ceases to be a right, it becomes merely a claim. So in this context, what is interesting to an economist is that if you look across this spectrum, when you define a right, the more difficult it is to enforce the claim costlessly through political process, the more expensive it becomes to deliver on that right. Very good example of that in India, I will not elaborate, you should all know, is the right to education, which is a claim. I put to you, it is an extremely weakly defended claim, and therefore it has become very costly to defend this claim in terms of the resources we put to it, vis-a-vis, and the effort, vis-a-vis the output we get in terms of furthering the cause of the right to education. I fear this may happen with the right to health. It is happening, though in lesser magnitude, with the right to food. So this notion of rights as claims and costs is, I think, a fruitful area where at least the economics profession, actually, rather than human development, where the economics profession can engage with the idea of human rights, to be able to calibrate and quantify the extent to which the stipulation of a right is doable and to what measure. That's important in public policy because then when Jean Dress says we must have the right to education, we must ask, can we defend this claim? And what are the costs of not being able to defend it well? And the answer is therefore not to have the right to education, but to ask what priors need to be there in place to have an enforceable right to education. And by the way, this goes down to even more arcane things like bankruptcy. I have to constantly explain, because the lawyers here, you will understand, we successfully drafted, NIPFP did it, a bankruptcy code for India resolution process. That's been passed by Parliament, as you know. We have set up the institutions. Everyone comes to me in Bombay and says, now it's cool. Now we won't have those messy. I said, no. That won't happen. So what you have now is the establishment of a certain right to resolution. You, particularly being Indians, will now go to court. Because there are a number of scamsters amongst you, a number of you don't understand, a number of you probably think you can get away with stuff. So you will go to court, and there will be rulings, and then over time there will be a body of jurisprudence, and a moment will come when you go to your lawyer and say, don't go there, man. There have been 9 judgments. We ain't winning. So the problem in India, of course, is to do this in regular time will take the rest of my life. So one of the things that we're trying to do in the finance ministry is persuade the courts to take up bankruptcy and resolution cases and pass speedy jurisprudence type judgments. They can select what sort of cases are jurisprudential, and those should be fast-tracked. So again, here is another example in a much more arcane and much more boring domain, very interesting to me. Very interesting to you as Indians, it should be given that bloody scam. Of how the establishment of a right to a certain judicial process is not established until we have enough furniture in there for the claim to be valid. What cuts through this business of rights and claims and costs? Another important dimension which we often forget, which is power. The asymmetry of power and how it is held, which is reinforced by inheritance, which is reinforced by the inability to make weak defensive claims by those without power stronger, and is reinforced oddly enough by globalization and you're seeing the backlash in my view, when those in power then find and are able to commit to alliances beyond their country or Westphalian borders. All these things, I think, can also militate against a rights-based approach to development. By which I would say as an economist, what you cannot do in a rights-based approach is adopt a partial equilibrium analysis beyond a point. So if we do not address, for example, and I'm coming to the final part of what I was going to say, and I'm on time, I have 5 minutes, yes, in my 20. If you take the notion of the sustainable development goals, and let me give you a more provocative example. It's more fun. So I was involved in this Paris business. I mean, the way people like me get involved is we are involved till about 2 months before. Then the substance is done. Then the NGOs and the people go there, and I don't know what they do. I've never been. You can't get a hotel room anyway. So G20 summits, the summits are bad places for people down in the food chain like me to go. You end up sharing a hotel room with a shared bath because there are 19 prime ministers and 40 heads of state. But 2 months before, you get a lot of serious work done. So in that serious work, I noticed, it went on about a year and a half, and I was working on climate finance, that everyone was telling me that, all the world's children are common. We are common. I was very surprised. I said, these Germans now, suddenly my children are their children. They used to be 15 years ago. Anyway, maybe they've changed their minds, and now we all have a common, all children in the world are common, so we must protect the environment. And I said, okay, so what do you want me to do? And they said, we want you to look at your patterns of production and consumption. I said, that's great. Why don't you look at your patterns in production and consumption? Let's have a global energy or carbon budget, and let's talk about it. They said, no. We are not going to reduce our consumption. We are just going to move from thermal to solar and make sure that our per capita emission of carbon for a given level of consumption is down. That's our commitment. Now you make a similar one. I said, I can't do that. I'm going through development transformation. And you're asking me to be the first country in the world to complete my development transformation without recourse to fossil fuels. You're asking me to defy sociology. I cannot go and tell somebody in that village who has worked hard and has enough money now to buy a car which he has been watching all his life, not to buy that car, sorry. Because if I have to do that, there are political costs. So I can do it if you do the following. Would you please go back to Norway, or wherever you, let's not speak on Norway. Austria. It's a cold place, right? They're reasonably cold. And in winter, do me a favor. Switch off your heating, put on some overcoats, and have dinner. Reduce your consumption. Give me that political mileage. Can you do that for me? No. Why should I do that? So I said, then you see, you're exercising asymmetric power at different points in time. Do you understand what I mean? The positive result of a reduction of an efficient reduction in the carbon emissions per unit of consumption is fine for an economy at steady state, but an economy that is in a development transformation is also in an aspirational transformation. And I cannot deal with that aspirational transformation in the way you can. We are not rich enough for my rich to take public transport. And for my emerging rich not to want to use cars. And therefore, if you want to change in mindset, I require sacrifice. And I don't see it. So that is what I mean by the asymmetry of power. It comes in many ways. And one problem with the SDGs, which are much better than the MDGs, which as Sudarshan knows, I was part of a group that wrote the indicators for. And I was also one of the co-authors of our VNR. And I can tell you it doesn't mean much. Is basically that it acknowledges that peace and security and other such things are important. But it is profoundly silent on power. And that is how it is with a fundamental problem that we have in the architecture of international governance, which is that power is exercised fundamentally through Westphalian means. Individual nation states exercise power. In the IMF and the World Bank, that exercise is made explicit, and it is tied to your per capita income level, as it is in a rating agency. And it is for that reason I would submit that finance ministers are so worried about growth. It's not that they have chosen growth to reify growth over all other instruments. It is because in an environment where the international balance of power chooses growth to understand who has how much power in a system which is essentially the rules of which are moderated by Westphalia, I'm afraid until you change those rules away from growth, it will continue to dominate. The UN is an absurdity in this sense because it has frozen the balance of power according to the level of per capita GDP after a major world war and after the collapse and crisis of one of the 5 countries that hold balance of power in the UN, and has not modified it. Therefore, taking the claims that the UN makes with respect to the SDGs will, if not be cynical, will undoubtedly have to be instrumental, which is what my conclusion was when I was a co-author of this voluntary national review business I did for ECOSOC. And this is why I've written about this. I'll share it with you. The UN fails as a development system. Because while today there is little reason to expect that anything except a new multilateral consensus will maintain the gains we get from cooperating with each other economically, and that has to be at the root of development. The contradictions of Westphalia we have not overcome. And for me, the missing language in the SDGs is the inability to overcome the contradictions of Westphalia. This has profound implications for emerging economies like India, but it also means recognizing some truths as a moral, as you said, for the common good, as a moral good about many countries in the world. I put to you, which I could never do in the UN, and it used to keep me awake at night, the proposition that the Central African Republic will never ever be, a self-sufficient, democratic, high-income country. It cannot. Its borders will not allow it. I put to you that the state of Jamaica will require international help, even more international help going forward. And I put to you that several landlocked and small island states will require international resource flow transfers to them as a moral obligation. But if we are going to do it under the pretense that those resource flows will come without a diminution in national ownership or national sovereignty, then we are fooling ourselves. That's never happened in the history of the world when such flows are significant, and it will never happen tomorrow. And doesn't matter whether it's going to be the USA or India or China directing those flows. But that honesty in discourse is not there, and nor is there an inquiry into the understanding of how power mediates these things. So to conclude, I'm fascinated by this conference. I hope, when I started I didn't know I could, but I hope I have managed to touch upon different organizing elements of this vast canvas that you have set up. I trust that the conference will, there's certainly very interesting speakers that I shall watch with great interest. I understand you're recording it, some of the sessions of the conference. I'd like to congratulate Jindal for breaking new academic ground and doing this. And I hope that you will give attention to the uncomfortable questions of power and ontology, equal weight with the more technically tractable questions that this conference inevitably includes in its, wonderful campus. So congratulations and have a great conference. Thank you. So any questions? Yep.
Introduce yourself and then.
In the mic, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm Alicia Mehta. I'm from the 4th year of law school. I wanted to ask something with regards to power, which you focused on so much. Where do you see the dynamics of and paradigm of power when you respond to human rights and development? Because power itself is something that doesn't, in my understanding, accept the notions of human rights that we textually understand them to be, because it's extremely self-oriented and self-centered, which sort of falls on the other side of the spectrum of how we understand human rights. So how does the power dynamics address in a nuanced form the concept of human rights and development?
Well, let me be inductive. It must have, otherwise we wouldn't have human rights. I mean, after all, the dynamics of power exist in Nordic countries as much as in India, etc. And we know that notions of justice, not equity necessarily, notions of justice can cause huge public anger. We see that in authoritarian societies, and we see that in other societies. We know that people don't like to be locked up without cause. And we know that the use of coercive power by any state, if I take a subset of power, or any society, is always subject to mediation. So given all these things, I would not agree with you that basically power and human rights lie on other sides, or on different sides of the same of a fence. The exercise of power between individuals, within societies, by government is mediated, and it is mediated by political contract, it is mediated by social settlement, it is mediated by social mobilization. So all these become, if you like, theaters in which this interaction with human rights plays out. I'll give you an example very briefly. You may not know this, but there's human rights in public finance, because the power of the state to tax is the most coercive and arbitrary power ever given to any collective. And it is given under some conditions. It used not to be in the time of, let's say, Emperor Babur or Ashoka, not Ashoka, next door, Emperor Nanda. The social contract was what? If you were a nice king, I did something for you. But otherwise, you gave me taxes because you were the king, simple. Now, we have a notion of obligation when we talk about the taxpayer. Even though, if you don't pay your taxes today, it is easier for me to tap your telephone sitting in the Ministry of Finance than it is for the Ministry of Home Affairs. I don't know if you know this. We can do it very simply. It takes about 2 hours for me to tap your telephone, break into your Facebook. Ministry of Home Affairs is to go through a whole judicial process. All right, we don't have to go through any judicial process in the Ministry of Finance. So, but that exercise of power clearly somehow has been tempered. And it has been tempered through the mechanisms I speak of. So I think that is the terrain in which you need to research it, rather than this black and white, there's power and there's human rights.
Any other question?
So especially with regards to technology and the costs of shifting from one technology to another, because that is essential when we are talking about how to reduce our carbon emissions. I'm surprised, and maybe I'm wrong here, but there isn't enough talk on technology transfer. Because on one hand, we see China developing technologies that could potentially make energy production much cheaper, and that technology isn't being shared with the rest of the world. China is colluding with Russia on that front. On the other hand, there are now new fabrication technologies for solar panels which could make them much, much cheaper than they are, and they're not being shared with other third world countries. So on one hand, when Western countries make demands of third world countries to change our emission patterns, why isn't there these talks happening on the other front?
It's a fantastic question. Is there any other question? I'll take one final one. I'll take them both together. Yes, please.
Thank you. I wanted to hear if students had questions first, but I'll go ahead. I wonder if, in the context of today's discussion, describing rights as claims and cost is too myopic a view, that maybe we should be looking at the political economy of human rights, how human rights contribute either on a macro level to the development of the state. So we can find examples, like China allows Hong Kong to stand more or less on its existing system because they view that system of the rule of law and rights as likely to contribute both to Hong Kong's economic well-being and to China's. Or we could look at Amartya Sen did. He says you never have a famine in a democracy. So even on the low end of the economy, that there's a lot of ways of it where rights serve to provide inclusion and contribute to development, and not simply as cost and claims.
If I may, I'll take his first. No, I think I didn't explain myself well. I was not saying that rights impose costs. I was saying, in fact, if you take for a minute my postulate that a right is a claim, and when it is well defended, it becomes a right. So the cost comes when the right is not well defended. So when you have weakly defined rights, which therefore are, so if you think of a right, any right, a spectrum of rights, right to education. If I was able to implement and enforce the right to education such that the claim was in every respect a right for every Indian that the right applied to, it would not be costly. In fact, the cost would be predictable and the results would be generally good, and there would be no difficulty. The difficulty is if in the implementation of that right, it stays a claim for some, that some are unable to defend their claim. And the greater that number, the greater what I call, so this is political economy, political settlement costs. Because when you have a system of rights which are justiciable especially, then when they're not enforced, then it creates costs, because those who seek to claim it will fight to enforce their claims, and those who inhibit these people from claiming their right will fight for them not to have their claim. So you get that level of cost. So my limited point was, when we define a right and call it justiciable, we need to make sure that the situation in which the right is enforceable exists to a reasonable extent possible before we develop that right. So for instance, today if I said every Indian has the right to fly by air, you probably wouldn't be able to enforce it at all. There would be too many hindrances there, so I would not enforce it. But I could say, well, under what circumstances could I have this right? That's the context in which I meant this. And on democracy, by the way, I disagree with Sen. It's convenient to talk about famine. I know lots of democracies that have had lots of genocide. So it's not automatic that democracies generate good things. They may not result in famines because of information flows. But terrible things can happen to rights under democracies, terrible things. Your question is very dear to my heart. We have a problem, mate, in India. It's an interesting problem with exactly what you said, the policy problem. So public policy students, please listen to me a couple of minutes and I'll shut up and let you get on with the conference. We took a $100 million loan from SoftBank Japan. Sorry, 100 billion. Yeah? Basically to do what? To build our green energy ecosystem. That's a lot of money. We basically, that pays for 30% of our target. I'll get for 100 billion, I'll get 30, 40 gigs. Yeah? When I looked at the numbers, I said, wow, this is amazing. The Japanese got 0.5% interest over a 30-year amortization period. That's practically free money. I was like, surprised by the Japanese doing this. And one day, by coincidence, a year and a half ago, this became a cabinet note, I wrote, I said, can I see the revenue streams from the projects? And I looked at the revenue streams from the projects, and between 18 and 25% of the revenues from these power projects were to revert to the Japanese firm supplying, that was tied, these solar panels as intellectual property payments. So essentially our greening, and there are 5 producers of panels, forget China, we can't buy from China, you know why. So we have Germany, France, US, Japan, and somebody else, I can't remember, who makes panels competitively. All these countries have lots of old people. So if I really wanted to be disruptive, I would say that this entire business of going green is basically an excuse for the young people in the developing world to pay for the pensions of old people in the developed world. Because if 20% of my money is going as intellectual property rights back to Japan, that's great for the Japanese budget. That's a lot of old people they're going to be able to pay for at 2% interest, I know. Therefore, we need to be very, very careful about the terms and conditions under which we access these technologies, and we have to be firm that we understand what's going on. So I'm very glad you asked that question. I have another interesting public policy conundrum in that respect. So this is a real-time problem. I don't have a solution. I've talked to every professor I know in Columbia. I went there for a month. Couldn't find a solution. So let's say the cost of producing solar power today is X per gigawatt. I'm told by all science that in 3 years it will be 0.8x. And in 5 years it will be 0.6x. So as an economist, I'll tell you, don't invest a penny today. You'll be jailed. Because if I know for certain that something is going to be 20% cheaper 2 years from now, it is by public duty to maximize taxpayer value by investing then. So basically what I need here is the asymptote. I need to know when there is no asymptote. I'm told, in fact, that the marginal cost of electricity 15 years down the line may be 0, in which case I shouldn't be investing anything. And I should be, in fact, producing more from coal if this happens. Now, this is a classic example of a public policy problem where there is a misalignment of interest, because when I talked to the current head of UNDP, who's a good friend of mine, he said, you are reifying your narrow interests over the interests of the world. We can't have that sort of conversation. Because this is, even if I didn't have in India, this is a general problem for all governments that are investing massively without subsidy in solar. So I hope I have answered your question satisfactorily. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roy. Now I would like to invite Dr. Vayasa Murthy to give the concluding remarks.
There's a lot of emphasis on development, and for right reasons. But if we ask ourselves how much of this development is inclusive, how much of it is responsible, or whether it is a really sustainable one, the answers are very difficult to find. And so that's in this context, the Center for Human Rights Studies is pleased to organize this important conference in collaboration with the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy and the Program on Human Rights and Development, Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, Harvard University, and there are many other, for instance, Professor Rajkumar mentioned about the various things like common good, public policy, and all. We need rights-based approaches to poverty reduction. We need rights-based approaches to development. And in this backdrop, I want to acknowledge the presence of Ms. Maya Darulwara, Senior Advisor with the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, which published a wonderful book as far back in 2000 one of the first ones on the human rights-based approaches to poverty reduction. And I want to profusely thank Dr. Ratin Roy for delivering a keynote address and also taking pains to answer all the questions that have been posed. And he was at our university 2 years back for giving a commencement speech at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. And we thank you for all your support and encouragement. And I also acknowledge the presence of Mr. Panda, Special Rapporteur from the National Human Rights Commission, and Professor Syed Ahsan from South Asian University, and Mr. Harsh Shetty, and many other distinguished panelists who have accepted our invitation. And we have had a few cancellations at the last minute. Ms. Madhu Kishwar, who agreed to participate and who backed out yesterday. And we made an earnest effort to maintain gender diversity in various panels. And it's because of the few cancellations which came at the last moment. And with this, I want to thank all of you for participating in this morning's function. And we now have a tea break. And I request all of you to come back for the first session, which is on a very important theme, that is approaches to measuring and addressing poverty at 10:30. Okay. At 15-minute break, 10:45. You please come back, and thank you. Thank you.